Okay, let's give a recap of where we're at. I still need to install the clutch assembly. I checked inside the clutch kit and I found out that I do have the pilot bushing, so we're going to install that also, and the clutch, because we're going to need to put those things in before we install the engine. In addition to that, I repositioned these wires a little bit. I looked at the footage from the disassembly just to try and make sure that I was doing everything correctly. Another thing that I realized was I'm going to have to take this nut off because this, I believe, attaches to a bracket in here that we're going to need to deal with. And one more thing, I found out where that bracket goes, which is right up over here. So we're going to get this clutch assembly on here. We're going to install the slave cylinder / throwout bearing assembly into the transmission. And then we'll be able to get this guy back inside this truck. Hopefully you'll hear it run today. Okay, like I said, after looking at the footage, this bracket goes right there and right down here. Before I install this pilot bushing, I'm gonna check it on the input shaft. I'm just gonna put it on, make sure it fits, and it does. So I'm very happy. It fits nice and snug, and that's exactly what we want. So I feel confident in installing this. I would hate to install this and have it not work. So I just want to check its fit up against the thing that it's going to go against to make sure that it goes in. Now probably the best thing to install this with would be like an old input shaft or something like that that fits. But it's just an interference fit in the back here, and you just got to tap it in. Now this is brass, so it's a very soft metal. So I'm also going to use a hammer I'm either going to use the plastic side or the brass side so that I don't damage it as it's going in. I'm just going to install it dry, no lubricants or anything. Just going to make it flush in there. Now I'll install the pressure plate and clutch, but before I do, I'm going to take my clutch alignment tool and just check, see how it fits in there. It actually fits pretty decent, so I'm very happy with that. Now, as you've seen in other clutch videos, I take the pressure plate, a little bit of brake clean, and my rag, and get off the rust inhibitant or cosmoline that they put onto these things so that they don't rust. All I'm really concerned about is the area where the clutch makes contact. As far as everything else, so what? It doesn't make contact with the clutch. Okay, I'm just going to take my clutch and pressure plate assembly. Remember that this side of the clutch plate faces the inside of the pressure plate because it's stepped. If you try to put this on the flywheel side, it's not going to work out so good. So I'm just going to install that there. Put my alignment tool up through the center. And then try to find the sweet spot where all the holes line up. Hey, so far so good. All right, initially I'm just going to run these down till they're snug, but the entire time I'm tightening them, I'm just going to wiggle this clutch alignment tool, and that'll help position the clutch in such a way to where the input shaft will go in easily when we install this into the engine compartment. So that's kind of critically important to what we're doing here. All right, now we're starting to get to a place. And then periodically check it, just to make sure that the clutch alignment tool goes in and out easily. And the reason we want to do this is, like I said, if the clutch is slightly up or down when we tighten the pressure plate down, what's going to happen when we go to run this in is the input shaft is going to have a hard time reaching that pilot bushing. So we want to make sure that it's just a straight shot and we don't have to worry about fighting it when we're trying to put the engine in, because we're sort of doing it backwards. I mean, most times when you do this, you're trying to mate the transmission up to the engine. And I'm kind of randomly going around right now, but when I do my final tighten, I'm going to do sort of that star pattern like you would with a lug nuts. Once you start tightening this down and you feel the pressure plate putting pressure on the clutch, it's not going anywhere. So as far as the wiggle thing, once you get past a certain point, don't bother. Now that they're all snug, I'm going to go around it with a torque wrench. Now the torque spec that I found was like 13 to 20 pounds, which is a pretty big range. So I'm going to split the difference because it's easy to set my wrench up for 15. There, I've got it set up to 15 pound-feet. I didn't do what I said I was going to do as far as how I tighten them up, and I apologize for that, but sometimes you just got to go with it. It just seemed more natural to go around so that I didn't miss any of them, and I think since it was snugged up, then I'm okay. I think the important takeaway here is that you make sure that you use the torque wrench when you're putting a pressure plate on. That way everything's even. That way there's no abnormalities in clamping force as far as the way the pressure plate makes contact with the clutch. I normally like to do this. So I break out my torque wrench at certain times. You see me often just tightening things with impact guns in my hands. But things like clutch plates or pressure plates, those are things that I usually break out the torque wrench for. Oh, I almost forgot. For those of you wondering, I believe the flywheel bolts, which would have been a good idea to torque those too, come to think of it, I believe those were somewhere in the 45 foot-pound range. I'm sorry, it's 41 to 47 foot-pounds. All right, well, the addition of the clutch, pressure plate, and pilot bushing pretty much complete our engine installation, or I should say our engine reassembly. So now let's go into the truck, change out the throwout bearing / slave cylinder assembly, and get everything ready to get this thing back in the truck. I'm going to take my oil pan and put it under the front of the bell housing. This way, when I remove the hose for the slave cylinder, all the brake fluid won't go dripping on the floor that I'm going to have to lay in while I reassemble the engine. Meanwhile, back at the transmission, the new slave cylinder came with a special tool that is apparently good for knocking the bleeder loose, but it's also good for getting the line off of the slave cylinder. So given that it's like down in there and difficult for me to get to because I'm actually leaning over the front of the truck, I'd climb in here with you, but it'd be a little crowded for us. I'm just gonna disconnect this from the transmission, and then after I do that, I'm gonna disconnect the line. So the line is flexible. It's over here, you know, at least to some degree it's flexible. And I'll be able to pull it through, and then I'll disconnect the line after I get it off the transmission. These are two 10mm fasteners. Now hopefully we can remove this enough. Nope, not quite enough. We're gonna need to disconnect that clip. And I don't know, I'm thinking from what I'm seeing here, oh, I get it. Let me give you a close-up of this. All right, this is what we got. This collar actually moves down. I don't know if you can see that when you put this tool in here, and when you do that, it makes it so that it releases the line for the slave. I'm just gonna try pulling on that now, see if it'll come loose. Maybe it needs to go the other way. No, I think it needs to come in this way. Get compressed in this direction, and once that's done, there we go, it just pulled free. So I'm gonna let that sort of drip into my bucket underneath here while we remove the slave cylinder. All right, here's our old and new slave cylinders. They do differ a little bit. One of the things that I'm noticing is there's a little nipple on the end of this. bleeder where there is not one here. A little disappointed by this because with the method that I'm going to choose to bleed the system out, it would be really nice to have a bleeder end like this. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like I can switch those two things over because this is not a threaded hole. We've done videos on aftermarket parts before. It does look like that we have a just a clip that's going to be inserted when the line is inserted into this collar for the slave, and they gave us a new O-ring that we're going to replace also. On top of that, it looks like these two things are different in that I have to install this looks like throwout bearing assembly onto here. I'm a little confused as to how I'm going to do that. They look like they're the same height, and I think I'm just going to leave it because I don't think there's really much that I can do here. I don't know if I pull this out. I think I do. Let's see. Well, this is a bearing assembly. It's just a little strange how this one is so much different than the original. But once again, they're the same height, which is important. So I'm gonna go with this and just install it on the vehicle. Sometimes blind trust is all you got. All right, a little investigation before I go and put this on the vehicle. I found out that on the original equipment slave cylinder, you can pull this off and you can swap this over. On my replacement, it doesn't come like that, so it's not going to be a concern. But you can swap out just the bearing on the slave cylinder, which is kind of a good thing. It would make it easier. However, we are going to replace the entire slave cylinder as a preventative measure to, alleviate any possibility of leaks in the future, because we'd have to go through all this trouble again if it did leak. So let's get this thing back on the truck. All right, we're just going to install our new slave cylinder / throwout bearing. Like I said, I'm going to replace the O-ring here. Just going to pry the old one off with a pocket screwdriver. They also gave me a new one of these plastic sleeves. New plastic sleeve. New O-ring, which actually a little bit of this brake fluid will help lubricate it. Just gonna push it into place. Kind of gonna be a two-handed operation. I'm gonna need to push it into place and then drop the clip on there. I almost think I'd have better luck from underneath with this. I'm in a very awkward position where I'm at now. So I think I'm gonna slide underneath this and see what I can do to reach it from that angle. I'm under it now. That was not a good noise. Now I have to find it. Okay. Let's see if we can get this done. There's a lot less room under here since I lowered it to get the engine out. Still want to do this for a living, kids? I'm certainly beginning to regret my choice of replacing this. If I were to do this again, I certainly wouldn't use this brand of slave cylinder, and I would just leave well enough alone and just replace the outer bearing assembly. Once again, I'm not happy with my bleeder here, but there's nothing I can do about it. I couldn't even swap it over from one to the next because the slave cylinder on the old unit had a different attachment for the bleeder. This one threads it and the other one has a little pin that holds it in place. So there was really no way to swap them around.
So I'm just gonna have to make do with this.
Okay, so we don't want our clutch to run dry. So we're gonna make sure that, yeah, that doesn't look so good down in there. I don't know if you can see that, but there looks like there's a bit of sediment down in there. Yeah, it looks like a little bit of goo. I think what I'll do is I'll get all this old stuff out of here, put new and clean it out, put new stuff in to start with. This is the trouble with being a conscientious technician. It takes time and often more effort. A lot of technicians aren't bad technicians, it's just after a while you give up. You get tired of trying to deal with the messes that are created either by other technicians or by customers or whatever. It takes quite a bit of patience to stay in the game. Alright, well, I feel much better that we've got some new fluid in there. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to open this up and let this gravity bleed out for a minute. Looks like it kind of bleeding out right now. Now, I wanted to use a vacuum bleeder on that, but I'm going to have to come up with something to rig up an attachment to get down in there so that I can do that. But honestly, I can do that after I get the engine in. So for now, we're going to lubricate the splines, lubricate the front of the throwout bearing, and get this engine in here. So we need to make some progress. Now the people that provided me with the clutch actually gave me spline lubricant. And this, looks like I'm going to have to cut it a little better. But this will go on the splines and make it so that the clutch can release and move freely on the input shaft. And then I'm going to put just a little bit of high temperature lithium grease on the throwout bearing. I usually do that because moving parts of the throwout bearing and clutch assembly, if they're lubricated, gives you a nice clutch feel. But you don't want to go too much because what will happen is it'll contaminate the clutch material. So very little lubricants here, but a little bit will go a long way. Yeah, I suspect that this is moly grease, molybdenum, and there's so little of it. And I think they did that on purpose because they don't want you to goop it all up. I don't blame them. So they want a little bit of moly grease here. Okay, good enough for me. Okay, now just a little bit of white lithium grease on the face of the throwout bearing, and now I'm done. I'm going to put just a tad on this part of the input shaft, just enough to make it go together easier. Alright, now my parts guy sent me a gasket that wasn't of the correct size, so unfortunately I'm going to have to reuse this old exhaust gasket. It's not that bad, and these are graphite gaskets, so you can reuse them. I'm not happy about it, but I gotta do what I gotta do. So that's going back on. And I'm gonna raise the transmission up a little bit so that it can make contact with the engine a little easier if it's higher up like that. This is that piece of weather stripping, I don't know if I talked about this, that I had to pull back so that I could get to this top bell housing bolt. You'll definitely find that helpful, but I couldn't show you that while it was up under here, and I'll have to, it just slides up onto this lip. So raise the transmission and get this engine ready to go in. I'm ready for this job to be done. Good to see this thing finally heading back in. You got to be careful. You can see we got a harness that we need to make sure that we don't pinch in between there. And a lot of things like that we need to be mindful of. In fact, we have a lot of stuff over here that we need to make sure that stays out of the way, that we don't smash in between the bell housing and the back of the engine. So go slow here, be careful. And we're just going to go for this engine mount because remember we took the other one off. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to try to mate the engine to the transmission. I'll get that done, get a couple of bolts in, and then I will put the other engine mount on the other side and then drop it into place and then finish with my bell housing bolts. It's good to have a plan. Work slow, work careful. You'll get it done. With all the stuff that needs to get done here, you may be asking yourself, did you get everything? Well, it's okay to ask that. In fact, it's a good idea that you ask that. So if you're methodical, it's very helpful. But once you get to this point, you're just about to the point of no return. So make sure you got your T's crossed and your I's dotted before you get this far. So far, I think we're in the green. Of course, the first thing that falls off is that exhaust casing. Found it. Starting to get a little crowded in here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the input shaft to go into the clutch, into the back of the engine, but at the same time I'm trying to fight past the other engine mount and everything else. So I may end up taking the other engine mount off. As you can see, I've kind of got my work cut out for me here, trying to mate these two things up. Because here we are with the engine mount, which is down in front, so I can't necessarily get past that to get down in there. So we're gonna have to get creative to try to slip this in here. What I'm seeing here is that the engine block needs to come down ever so slightly here to mate up with the bell housing. So we need to come down on the right side a little bit. It's difficult to see other than under here, but I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to rotate the engine down a bit on the right, pick up the left side, and see if that'll help guide me in. I almost think that I actually inserted into the clutch. So that's a good thing. So we should be able to drive it home if we can get the bell housing and everything lined up right. The more I look at this, the more I realize that getting this engine mount out of my way, it's going to be extremely helpful. So I'm going to remove that now, and I'll replace it along with the other one once I get the engine mated up to the transmission. This way it'll give me some wiggle room. Right now I'm limiting myself with this mount, so I think it's much better that I take it off. It's only those 3 fasteners, And once it's made it up to the transmission, I should be able to bolt it back up just fine. That gives us a heck of a lot more wiggle room. It's a tedious process, to be sure. I'll check in with you in a bit. All right, I've been fighting with this for about, 45 minutes now. And I'm a little disappointed because initially I had the engine, or I had the input shaft into the back of the engine, or at least in through the clutch assembly. But I seem to have lost that, and I'm having a very difficult time getting it back in there. One of the things that I'll show you that I did was I stuck a pry bar down in here, and I'm able to move the engine quite a bit to try to wiggle it into place. But that's pretty much what I've been doing is just trying different things. I'll either go down and raise the transmission a little bit or lower it down and just try to basically line up that input shaft to try and get that to go through the clutch and into the back of the engine. Once that's done, we're good. I mean, this is where having an automatic transmission makes life a lot easier, because with an automatic transmission, you don't have to worry about that. It's pretty much you just mate the torque converter up and away you go. And those are pretty easy. But these manual transmissions are a little more difficult. In fact, right now I'm wondering if it might have been better just to pull the engine and transmission out as a unit and then drop them back in as a unit. I think that might have been the way to go, because it would have saved me a lot of time. It would have cost me a little time taking out that transmission mount, but that was just one mount, and also taking the shifter out of the inside of the car. So something you might consider if you are going to do this job is taking the engine out and transmission as an assembly if you have a manual transmission. If you have an automatic transmission, don't waste your time. But if you got a manual like this one, I would say that's definitely worth consideration. But I'm just going to continue to fight and see if I can get this thing to go together. Something I'm noticing that I'm going to need to be careful of is that is the crank sensor, and it's making contact with where that engine mount goes there, and as a result it's kind of tearing it up a little bit. So I have to be really careful not to break that sensor, or else I'll be buying a crank sensor. Right now I think I can clean it up, get it plugged in, and I'll be okay. But if I do that too much, I have some more things to deal with here. Okay, 2.5 hours later. Yeah, no kidding. You've been wanting me to spout expletives or something like that during one of my shows. Well, the camera was off. I could say that mating up a manual transmission to an engine is way more difficult than an automatic transmission. And this one in particular, just for whatever reasons, just gave me a lot of problems. But I do have one bolt in now. I'm going to show you which one I started with. I'll show you the method that I did it with. Sorry I didn't have the camera on during that time, but I needed both my hands, and I couldn't be worried about you at the moment. So I'm going to catch you up to speed now. All right, we have, of course the camera won't focus, this bolt started back here on this ear between the engine and the transmission. Basically what it took was I kept changing the location of this, kept moving it forward so that I could get the front of the engine to come up a little bit higher than the rear of the engine. That worked somewhat. The next step was, instead of having my pry bar up in here to try and move things around, I switched and went up under here and caught this ear on the block back under here. And I kept wiggling this, and when I was pushing on the chain, I kept pushing on it like this. And what that would do was that would sort of cause the front end to jump. And also I had my ratchet handy to where I was spinning the crank every once in a while, because sometimes what will happen when you're trying to get that input shaft to go through the clutch is the splines won't quite line up. And if you spin the crankshaft, you'll spin the clutch a little bit and it might just fall into place. You might get lucky. And that's pretty much what this is. This was a fight until I got lucky. Let me show you underneath. All right, here's another view of the bolt that I have started. And it's good to start with that one because I was barely able to get down in there, but also it has a dowel on it, and that's what pretty much aligns the transmission to the engine. So now that I have one bolt in, it's like I'm home free almost. I'm gonna start the bolt on the other side and start drawing the two together. Then I will reinstall I took out the crank sensor, and I'll show you that in a second. I removed the crank sensor. I removed, what else did I remove? Oh, and I installed like a little plastic plug in its place so that stuff wouldn't get in there. Why don't I show you that now? So that was actually the plug that came with the slave cylinder. But I took that out, and I'm glad I did, because it kept making contact with that engine mount there. So I'm glad that's out of the way and I no longer have to worry about it. But I'll have to reinstall that crank sensor along with the engine mount on this side, and then I can drop the thing down on the mounts, and I think I'm going to call it a day after that. It's kind of getting late. I'm going to have to come back this week to try and wrap this thing up. It's been fun. A lot of fun. The tension is off the floor jack. I can remove it. There are two fasteners, one down on this side and one down on that side, that are now secure. So the engine is officially secure to the transmission, so I can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm going to basically take a break from this because it's about wore me out, and then come back. But at this point, it seems like the hard part is over. So we will be back. We will continue. We will finish. We will win. It's going to be awesome.